Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Katie Rife.
So this is the part of the show where normally we would tell you what we are reviewing this week, the new releases hitting theaters that we're going to be talking about. But for reasons that should be obvious, I think, to everyone listening, we don't have new releases to talk about this week. Nothing is opening in theaters because of the national health crisis that is going on. So we're going to do something a little different today. We are going to just talk about what's going on right now and how the coronavirus has affected the film industry and sort of look forward to the future and see what to expect in the months to come, if we have any way of knowing that. And going forward, we're going to need to come up with some solutions on how to handle the current review slate or the lack thereof. And we'd love to keep doing the show. And I think we're going to have to be creative about that a little bit. And today we're going to be talking about a favorite movie of both of ours that maybe has a little bit of contemporary relevance. But
maybe a little bit.
Let's start by talking about what's going on right now. First of all, how are you doing, Katie?
I'm doing okay. I'm in my apartment. I've been here for about a week. I'm not a big going out person anyway, so the first few days were like, sweet bliss. But it started to get a little weird today when I woke up and I was like, oh yeah, not going out again.
It's kind of already messing with my already not great work-life balance. You know, I already have a hard time setting, like, this is where work ends and my life begins, you know?
Yeah.
And now that I'm doing all of my work in the place where I sleep and otherwise inhabit, that's making those lines blurrier. We should say that normally we record this show in the AV Club studio. It is normally a video / podcast. If you normally consume this show as a video, you are not seeing our faces at the time being. You are just hearing our voices.
Yeah, sorry. You're missing out on all our outfit choices. Very sorry.
That's right.
You'll just have to imagine.
Yeah. So what's kind of remarkable to me is how fast this happened, obviously. I think the whole world is kind of dealing with that to some extent. Because a week ago, we were in the office. And a week ago, we were still looking at plenty of films opening in theaters. This began a few weeks ago. I want to say 3 weeks ago.
About 3 weeks ago was when it first started to show up on everybody's radar in the U.S. here real seriously.
The coronavirus has been a concern globally for much longer than that.
Yeah, Asia's been dealing with it for, months, and China, we'll talk about that more later, but they're starting to look at the end of the tunnel in China, so.
Yeah, but in terms of the film industry, I think the first major thing that was sort of like, this is going to be bigger than we were anticipating in terms of its cultural impact, was when they made the decision to move the new James Bond film, No Time to Die, which was supposed to open in mid-April, when they made the decision to move that to November.
Yeah, and when that happened, I was like, oh, well, that seems extreme, because mid-April seemed like a long time away there. And I was honestly, for me, the first moment where I was like, oh, wow, this is really real, was I was planning to cover South by Southwest for the site. And, had everything arranged. We were a week out from going, and then they canceled the festival. And at the time, I remember being like, this seems like a lot. This seems extreme. I was a little shocked by how big of a move it was, because there's a lot of money goes into something like that and a lot of planning. We were, deep into the planning. It was a week out. But now, 2 weeks later, looking back, I cannot imagine being in Austin right now. I absolutely cannot imagine it.
No, I mean, I think now it's funny. You're right, because 2 weeks ago, it seemed, at least to some Americans, it seemed like these were actions that seemed overly cautious or they were just playing it safe. And now it's impossible to imagine anybody carrying on with an event. It was announced today that the Cannes Film Festival, which is one of the last holdouts for a major event that's happening, in the next few months, they were holding out for a long time. Some speculate that they were waiting to see how much their insurance was going to cushion them for this. But
yeah, talk about a lot of sunk cost,
For sure.
Closing Cannes is
for sure
going to hurt a lot of people.
It is. So the Cannes Film Festival, officially as of today when we're recording this, is being postponed till later in the summer. I think June or July, they said, which to me seems optimistic, but we'll see. The James Bond film was the first of the movies on the release slate in the next few weeks to be pushed. From there, Peter Rabbit 2 was pushed. The announcement came that the Fast and Furious film was moving to a year from now, which made a lot of sense to me because that franchise is that's a very global franchise in terms of its appeal and how well it does overseas. So I think that was them making the decision, like, even if things turn out to be fine in America, we need to protect grosses overseas.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, and there was no way. I mean, the irony of it is, like, when was that release date scheduled before?
It was in May.
By then, China's movie theaters will be probably back open and running again, and ours won't be, but theirs will.
It feels unprecedented, honestly. I mean, I remember when all this started to feel very real to me, and this, I mean, given what we do, maybe this makes sense that it took this happening for all of this to feel real to me. But it was when I realized that there was not going to be a new release in theaters for a month, like a whole month. And I sort of did some informal polling on Twitter and was like, you know, does anybody know the last time that Hollywood went a full month without releasing a new movie in theaters? And the response I got, more or less, was that has not happened since Hollywood has been making feature films. We don't go that long without a new release. It just doesn't happen.
Last time there was a real big pandemic in America, you know, the Spanish flu, I believe the late 1910s, you know, the film industry hadn't, I'm trying to think of a better word, but congealed in the way it has now. It was more like spread out, you know. Hollywood wasn't the absolute epicenter of production. There were active film studios in other cities, and there weren't any big theater chains back then. It was very different, you know. It wasn't a big enough industry to really think about in these terms then.
Right, totally different terms, exactly. And as somebody else pointed out on Twitter, during World War II, film production actually increased.
Yeah.
You mentioned, we were talking beforehand, before we started recording, you mentioned that some people are comparing this to, on a cultural level, in terms of what it feels like to 9/11, to the aftermath of 9/11.
Yeah.
And
to me, this feels very different. I don't know. I mean, first of all, it's moving in slow motion, whereas 9/11 was relatively slow motion, you know, 2 weeks even compared to 9/11, where I was a senior in high school when 9/11 happened, and between first and second period is when I found out about the whole thing. So, you know, that was instant. And, you know, we say it's happening very fast, and it feels very fast and very slow at the same time.
Yeah.
And that was more of an external sort of threat where there might be a war. And this feels more of like the guy next to you could give you coronavirus. You know, it's like it's coming from a different place.
Well, and it did not affect the cinema calendar in the same way really at all.
Oh, no, not at all. Yeah. We were talking before the show.
There were movies out that week. You know, they did not cancel. I think, if I remember this correctly, and I was working at a movie theater at the time at a multiplex. I was also a senior in high school at the time. Hardball with Keanu Reeves, I believe, came out that Friday. Glitter was out a couple weeks later.
Yeah. The famous example is that, and people always talk about the records that came out on 9/11 because Tuesday used to be new record release day. And famously, Jay-Z's The Blueprint came out on 9/11. And that Ben Folds, Rockin' the Suburbs, came out on 9/11.
That's right.
Slayer, God Hates Us All, came out on 9/11.
Very poor timing with that one, I guess.
Well, we're perfect timing if you're Slayer.
Yeah, that's true. The real differences at the time were more a kind of skittishness about evoking 9/11 in movies that were already coming out. A couple things were delayed. I remember Collateral Damage, which is an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, was supposed to open that fall, and they moved it, I think. Honestly, just the title and the premise involved innocents being killed, so they moved that. There were also some things like there was an early trailer for Spider-Man, which came out the following summer, featured the two towers rather prominently.
Right.
Yeah, he builds a web between them to catch some criminals in a helicopter, I believe.
That's right.
That trailer completely disappeared, and there was a lot of question of I believe some movies were removing the Twin Towers from shots lest anyone be reminded of this, as if anybody could possibly forget about it.
Well, you know, now when you watch movies shot in New York in the 80s, you always notice them right away.
Oh, for
I'm
sure.
always like, oh yeah, there they are. Every single time you watch a movie shot in New York before 9/11.
And I remember when Gangs of New York came out about a year later, Gangs of New York made I felt this was a principled move on their part, almost a response to this movement. The movie basically ends with the two towers. We see them. And that to me felt like Scorsese being like, no, we're not erasing this history in film.
Well, when you're talking about, you know, concerns about content, that reminds me more of what happens occasionally, unfortunately, in America, as a movie will get delayed or pulled because of a mass shooting. That reminds me more of that than this. This is different.
No, this is unprecedented, you know?
Well, people don't seem to be backing away from content about diseases or pandemics at all. I personally think it's a terrible idea to watch Contagion right now. I think
I'm not watching it.
You're only panicking yourself, but just based on social media, that's a lot of people are watching movies about pandemics amid all this. I don't get it personally, but that seems to be the opposite of the usual cultural drive towards avoiding overly, I guess, traumatic or violent news contemporary content.
Well, I wonder if part of it is how fundamentally this health crisis is already changing the way a lot of people are living their lives. Now, with something like 9/11, certainly there was a lot of cultural and social waves that sent through American culture. There was a certain level of fear that people had that wasn't there before, but it was possible to ignore some of that and to go about your life.
Right.
For most Americans, if you didn't live in New York City.
You could hypothetically, not watch the news and have no idea. Well, apparently Jared Leto had no idea any of this was going on because he was on a silent meditation retreat in the desert. So he missed this whole thing until like 2 days ago.
That's very funny. So the other thing is that it's not just, and this all kind of happened within the last week. It's how crazy fast this has all happened. It's not just that movies aren't coming out anymore. Most of the major chains in America are closing. Yeah. You can't even go to an AMC if you wanted to. For a little while, they were essentially limiting attendance, so they were selling 50% of a theater.
Right, so you could hypothetically sit far away from each other.
It still seems like a risk that a lot of Americans shouldn't be taking anyway, but now most of the chains have just shut down operations altogether. There are also a lot of the smaller theaters, a lot of the art house theaters that remain in this country are shutting down too.
Yeah, and a lot of those are in precarious financial situations anyway. But, despite all that, the Music Box Theater here in Chicago, which is our home theater, it's the theater that I probably go to the most in this city. Mm-hmm. They're closed through the end of the month, but they will still be paying their employees their normal paychecks while they're closed.
It's nice.
And yeah, it's a really big thing because that is an effect of this whole crisis that obviously you worry about disease and it's potentially fatal and all that stuff. But everybody who works hourly in a place that's closed, if they don't get paid for 2 months, then the economy's going to fall apart. That's just really bad news. So it is nice to see smaller theaters that are not rich to begin with providing for their employees in this way. And on a slightly larger scale, the Alamo Drafthouse today announced that they would be paying their employees while they're on furlough because they closed the chain earlier in the week.
That's good. So this kind of leaves me with questions about where we go from here. I mean, one of the things that's happening that we're seeing already is that both smaller distributors and major studios are adjusting for the fact that a lot of people are spending all of their time indoors now. So Universal announced a few days ago that a number of their titles that I should say were still in theaters are going to be available to rent. So Universal is responding to this. They are making The Invisible Man as well as The Hunt and Emma, which is was released through their mini major subsidiary Focus Features. They're making all of those available to stream at home, like really, really closing the window between theatrical and home viewing, which generally is at least a couple months. And now these are movies that were in theaters a few days ago are now basically going to be you can watch them at home.
Yeah, for $20, which some complain about, but if 2 people watch it, then you're saving money already.
Yeah, totally. It's really not much of a difference. The other thing they're doing is Trolls World Tour, which was supposed to open in April, one of the many titles that was supposed to open and is now not opening, is going to be available as well on the day that it was opening in mid-April, and you can watch that at home now.
Oh, and speaking of the window, the theatrical to home video window, probably about a year before it would have happened normally, Disney put Frozen 2 on Disney Plus over the weekend.
That's right. Yep. And I think we're going to see more of this as the weeks go on. None of us know really how much all of this is going to change everything and how long the social distancing is going to be necessary, how long we're going to be doing it. The small distributors have been responding to it too, making titles that were initially planned for theaters available through streaming and VOD. I've seen a couple of distributors this week alone are announcing new ways that you can watch their films. Kino Lorber is one of them. Bacurau, I reviewed that 2 weeks ago? Feels like a year.
Doesn't
it? Yeah, we both liked that one, so that one's going to be available.
Yeah, that one is very weird and wild. wild. If you have not watched it yet, you'll watch the first hour and think like, what is this? It's like a typical film festival ensemble drama, but it does not end up there at all. So
that's very true. Oscilloscope is also... Basically, they're offering a number of their films. For $50, you can buy 10 of their films digitally, and some of that will go to the Cinema Workers Relief Fund. I think $10 of every purchase. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, it's actually called the Cinema Worker Solidarity Fund. And it started on GoFundMe earlier in the week because cinema workers, obviously not a rich group of folks to begin with. It's not a especially lucrative career. And a lot of them are out of work. And like we said, a lot of smaller theaters can't afford to pay them. And, we don't have a lot of details on what the strategy is with the big chains. So, we'll reserve judgment on that for now. But definitely there are smaller theaters whose workers who can't afford to pay their workers during a month-long shutdown. So it is on GoFundMe.com/Cinema Worker Solidarity Fund. And that's a fund that you can contribute to that will get, ticket takers, ushers, projectionists, and, programmers and just folks that work at theaters paid. It's raised $63,000 so far. And that will be, they have a system to, verify that you do work for a movie theater and you're out of work right now, but they distribute the funds out that way. You're seeing this in a lot of industries. The service industry is another big one where you're seeing a lot of bars and restaurants. People who live off tips are starting GoFundMes to try to, keep their income coming in. I wanted to add, Dowd, that it's not just Universal. Columbia is putting Bloodshot out on VOD early. And Warner Brothers is putting Birds of Prey out on VOD early.
Got it.
So,
yep. And I think we're going to see more of that too, honestly. And I think we're going to see things that were supposed to come out theatrically. More of them, I think, are going to hit streaming platforms. One that I would not expect them to do that with is Black Widow.
No.
There's no way Disney takes a bath on something that big by throwing it on Disney Plus.
My question for that one is, so everything that's coming out on VOD is coming out on VOD early. Yep. We have not yet seen a film that was supposed to be a big theatrical release going straight to VOD. That has not happened yet.
Well, Trolls will be. I mean...
Oh, sure, yeah.
You and I probably do not consider that a huge theatrical release. It's definitely the type of thing that were we not going through all of this, I would probably be assigning that to a freelancer rather than covering it myself.
Yeah, the short straw game that we play sometimes.
That's right.
Like, all right, who's going to get up on Saturday and go see Trolls? Because they always have the kids' movie screenings on Saturday morning, which is just insult to injury.
Yeah, so I think that qualifies, honestly. That would probably, if that were opening in theaters, that would probably be a fairly large hit.
Sure, top 3 probably.
Yeah. So I'm curious about the future and what is going to change going forward and how this is going to change the landscape of the film industry.
What I was going to say in terms of that is, we're talking about theatrical windows, and this is something that was a big question, that's been heavily under discussion for about the past, less than 10 years, 5-6 years, ever since Netflix decided that it was going to start doing day and date releases where it would release in theaters and on Netflix on the same day. That made a lot of theater owners very, very nervous. And there's already talk about declining theater attendance and how streaming is going to take over the market anyway. It's sort of treated as this inevitability, and they're pushing back to try to find ways to keep the film industry alive. It's a cycle that's sort of similar to the rise of television in the 1950s, where theaters felt that, people can just stay home and watch movies. We have to make movies bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I think it's not all of it, but I think it is part of the emphasis on tentpoles and blockbusters and event films. But at the same time, you see this sort of like inevitable creeping of streaming that is going to take over and kill movie theaters. And this could accelerate that quite a bit.
It could. I mean, I think that streaming platforms are one of the few arms of the film industry now that are probably actually going to do really well during this. And my fear partially is that I don't fear so much immediately for the major studios. I fear more for smaller distributors, or at least I fear a future where if you want to see a movie that was made for less than $80 million, your only option going forward is just to see it on VOD or streaming. That theatrical releases for smaller movies are going to halt entirely.
Right.
We don't know that will happen. That's just a fear that it could happen. This is going to do strange things to the release calendar. Obviously, like I said, we don't know when any of this is going to change or when we're going to return to anything like normalcy in this culture or in this country and even on a global scale. A lot of these movies, though, these films that were supposed to open theatrically are going to move later, are going to open later in the year. Optimistically, we'll say they could open in the fall if all of this is under control by then. At which point, how is that going to... I imagine we're going to see there's probably a lot of people right now sitting down and looking at release calendars and saying, how do we balance what we were supposed to open now against what we were supposed to open? Are we going to see summer movies that movies that did not open this summer moving to a fall calendar? Or are they going to move to the following summer? Are we going to see award movies moving further ahead to get out of the way of some of this other stuff? Are we going to see, again, this is optimistic because we don't really know what the state of anything is going to be by this time, but are we going to see this huge surplus of movies in theaters in November, let's say?
Right, because we talk about the blowing up of the traditional release calendar all the time on Film Club. And, there's certain things like January, crappy movies come out in January and stuff like that. That conventional wisdom is going away in some respects. But as you referenced, there are two big generally understood period of movies. First half of the year movies, which are blockbusters, what used to be called summer movies, and then back half of the year movies, which are awards movies. And, and like you were saying, I kind of don't think that they're going to hold stuff like Black Widow for a whole year.
Right. I actually would not be shocked if Black Widow showed up in that Star Wars spot. Because
Christmas?
There's no Star Wars movie this year. Yeah. If suddenly, of course, there's another Marvel movie, The Eternals, that's supposed to come out in the fall. So does that move forward? I don't know. Or I guess move back. I always confuse
Depends on the
two.
Continuity. I mean, because the Marvel movies do have a continuity, so.
They do, although Black Widow is a prequel.
Oh, okay. So they could just drop it in wherever.
Yeah, exactly. They can just insert that wherever. So that's a question. Another question I have is how this is going to affect film production. Obviously, there are things that we're shooting or things that we're going to shoot soon that are no longer on track. Are we going to see a period in the near future, maybe 18 months from now, that's about the time it takes to see these kind of changes happen. Are we going to see a period where there's just less movies because less are actually being made at the moment? Right.
Like the initial thought is like, well, take all the movies that aren't coming out now and put them in the spot of the movies where we are going to have a little bit of like a donut hole where everything that's in production right now, those months when those were going to come out are going to be empty too.
Right.
So the first thought is to just take everything that isn't coming out now and move it to then. But that interrupts things in a way that I don't really see happening. One, because of profit motive and wanting to get things out as soon as possible. And two, that, there is some thought put into the order that films are released, particularly franchise films.
Mm-hmm. That's true. I mean, an optimistic projection could be that maybe Hollywood will take this particular opportunity to invest in some smaller projects. The mid-budget movie. The mid-budget movie. That lost delight. Maybe we'll get some of those to fill the gap. Maybe studios will feel like taking a smaller chance on some films that don't. Because right now the model for Hollywood increasingly is investing enormous amounts of money in less projects. So you get these huge blockbusters and hopefully they connect with audiences. Hopefully they connect with the global market in China. We should say also that China supposedly is reopening their theaters.
Yeah, to give myself hope, I read up on what's going on in China, and I recommend it because it does make you feel a lot better. You're like, oh, okay, there is another side. They're coming out the other side, and they certainly don't have a perfect government in China. But so this is an article that ran in Variety today that they're planning to reopen Chinese movie theaters, but the studios there are very skittish, and obviously so are the studios here. Nobody wants to be the film that is the first film back in theaters that bombs because people are still scared to go to the theater.
Yeah.
So what they're doing in a lot of Chinese movie theaters is putting films that were popular back into theaters. And one of them is the Harry Potter films are just to fill the screens. So they're filling the screens with the Harry Potter films, number one, and some of them are big Chinese blockbusters. But there are also some kind of interesting choices for films that they're going to put into the theaters to fill them until the release calendar gets back to normal. One is Green Book, A Dog's Purpose, And this is the weird one to me, Capernaum, which is a film that came out in 2018, which tell the people what Capernaum is about now.
Yeah, it's a film from Nadine Labaki. It's a Lebanese drama from 2018, premiered at the Cannes Film Festival. It's about a 12-year-old boy in Beirut who he's living in extreme poverty, and he decides to sue his parents for giving birth to him.
It's a sort of a catalog of human misery, that movie. It is your first night out after being stuck in the house for 2 months. It is a very depressing choice, but you know what? You do you, Chinese moviegoers.
Yeah. So again, we don't really know what lies ahead for any of us or for the film industry. I will say that if is the thought I have at the end of this discussion, it's that I think I worry the most for movie theaters, and specifically for smaller movie theaters and for art house movie theaters. I think most of the chains will be fine by the end of this. Your AMCs, your Lowe's, etc. I worry more about the local theaters, especially because a lot of them have been struggling anyway.
Yeah. Well, there's that downturn that we've been talking about with streaming and everything. We talked about the mid-budget movie. Netflix has pretty much taken those over. Netflix original movies have taken the place of the mid-budget studio film. Unfortunately, as with most changes in the industry, it's the little guys who are going to suffer the most.
Totally. So I think there are some things you can do if you're concerned about your local theater. You can buy gift certificates. You won't be able to use them, obviously, until the theater opens again, but most theaters offer them online. You can buy them. That way they get the money now and then you spend it later, or you redeem it later. You can also buy memberships. Some theaters have that. I actually bought a membership to Music Box Theater here in Chicago a few days ago. These are things that you can do to just help these. I know that there's a lot of belt tightening going on, and a lot of people, even I'm sure some of the people listening to this, are facing their own financial struggles right now. But if you do care about your local theaters, and if you can give something, that's what I recommend, just because they're going to need help, because we don't know what kind of world they're going to be looking at by the end of this.
Yeah, and if you have an office job that you can still work from home and your paychecks are still coming in, now's a great time to rally around movie theaters.
Totally. So I mentioned at the top of the show that obviously what we normally do here on the podcast / video series is we talk about current releases, but there aren't a lot of those. There are a few opening next week, but nothing we'd necessarily devote a whole episode 2.
Yeah, there's something kind of interesting that I've been noticing. This might just be in the tiny ecosystem of Twitter, but there were a couple movies that have come out on VOD over the past couple weeks. One was the movie Swallow, which I wrote a review of. The review got a lot more eyes on it than I expected, and so I noticed that a lot of people were championing it on Twitter as something that you could watch at home during the quarantine. So there may be a small silver lining for films that were just going to get a VOD release anyway. They'll get more attention than they would have normally.
Totally. And I hope that is something that we see. So we'll probably, over the next few weeks, we may talk about some of those films opening. It'll just sort of depend on what's happening. I should probably stop using the word opening even. That's just my default, but none of them are actually opening in any theaters at all.
Uploading.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll talk about some of those, I'm sure, but we're also going to be trying to come up with creative solutions for things to talk about on this show. And today, what I'd like to do is talk about we'll say a favorite movie of mine, and I think of yours as well.
Oh, yeah.
It's a movie that I think has some disturbing parallels with what's going on. It's not Contagion.
Yeah, it's not too close. It's not literal.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not. Yeah, exactly. The movie is George Romero's Dawn of the Dead from 1978.
The original.
That's right. And yeah, this is a movie that I could not help think of a little bit during what's going on right now, just because it is a film about a pandemic of sorts. It's Romero's sequel to his original Night of the Living Dead, and though it was made 10 years after the original, it is set in the immediate aftermath of Night of the Living Dead, which creates this, I think, a very strange cognitive dissonance a little bit, that we are basically, we're seeing things in the film that we saw in Night of the Living Dead. I can't imagine what it was like maybe to go see Dawn of the Dead in theaters and realize that the movie is
Picking up immediately after?
It's basically picking up immediately afterwards. It's like the same time period, even though you're going from 1968 to 1978. You know, it's a huge cultural change. Fashions have changed.
I was going to say, just the fashions and hairstyles will be totally different.
Yeah, totally.
And surface difference. Night of the Living Dead's in black and white. Dawn of the Dead's in color.
Yeah, I mean, the filmmaking, I would say he grows enormously as a filmmaker in that period as well. So we're seeing a brand, kind of a different director in some respects.
Yeah, he made quite a few films in the interim.
How many times have you seen this movie?
I'd say since college, probably about 10 times. I'm not a huge movie rewatcher, but this is one that people put on a lot and gets programmed in movie marathons a lot. And the last time I saw it was, I think, about a year ago, not too long ago.
I watched it on Halloween, or slightly after Halloween. It's part of a horror movie marathon. It was like the last movie that I watched. And I watched a little bit of it last night as well, just in preparation for this. It's a movie that I can watch. I could probably watch this movie once a month and be okay with it. I'm not a huge movie rewatcher myself. There are films like this one that I will watch maybe once a year or something.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I don't obsessively rewatch things.
Yeah, that's a whole other conversation.
It is.
About rewatching movies. Although another thing that I've been hearing from a lot of people is they want to rewatch movies during this social isolation phase because it is comforting. It's like an old friend a little bit.
Totally. That makes sense. This film is not comforting in a lot of respects.
I was going to say, how did you feel after you watched it? Better or worse?
Well, honestly, I have such a relationship with this movie because I've been watching this movie since I was a teenager. And, and again, I do watch it maybe once a year, something in that range. Probably not literally, but I watch it a lot. And I have such a relationship with this movie that I can't really imagine exterior forces changing the way that I see it. One thing about it is that I remember I bought the Anchor Bay DVD release of it, which at this point was probably 15 years ago.
Yeah, that's old school Anchor Bay.
Yeah, for sure. It was a really nice package, and it was like one of those tons of special features. And one of the things about the package is that it contains several different versions of the movie. And I have to confess something, though. I've had that for years. I have never made it more than about 20 minutes into an alternate version of this movie. There's a European cut, there's a director's cut. I never watch more than 20 minutes of that before I switch back to theatrical. And what it comes down to for me is I'm so close to this movie that even like a single added scene or an extended scene doesn't feel quite right. Do you have any movies like that where you're like, I do not want a different version of this? The version that I know and love exists. Even if another version is better, it doesn't feel right. The rhythm's off.
I'll argue against it being better, and maybe this is a basic choice, but when I was a kid, I would watch Star Wars on VHS with my dad probably at least once a month, and I absolutely flat out refuse to watch the special editions. They make me really mad.
Oh, yeah. The special editions are a worse version of those
It's
movies.
worse. They put in all that bullshit with, like, Jabba the Hutt. No.
Yeah, it doesn't fit. One thing that really struck me rewatching this movie, beyond the fact that, I should say for starters, that there are some parallels. The opening of the movie is we meet one of our main characters. She works at a television news station, and she kind of wakes up from a nightmare, and she's in the middle of this chaos, and the whole station is basically consumed with chaos about what to do during this crisis. You have like some sort of government representative who is basically on TV talking to one of the anchors, and he basically is just like, I don't think people are really getting it through their heads, like how serious this is and what we need to do. And he's like, you have to destroy the bodies. We have to quarantine. And there's a little bit of, that was the one moment of the movie where I felt a little bit of some reverberations of what's going on right now,
I'll say it says a lot about, Romero's worldview and just kind of how this movie doesn't pull any punches, is that she wakes up from a nightmare into a worse nightmare. I think that tells you a lot about what you're in for.
Totally. I love that choice. Basically, the movie follows about 4 characters. They flee in the night. They get on a helicopter and flee the station in the night. They get out of the city. And I believe 2 of them are police officers and 2 of them work for the station. Yeah,
one of them is he flies the helicopter for the traffic helicopter. That's why they call him Flyboy.
That's right. So shortly into the movie, they end up at a shopping mall. And this is numerous college grad papers have been written about the setting and about the fact about what the movie's saying about got that. And there's a particular line of dialogue where someone says, it's instinct. They're coming back to a place that was important to them when they were alive.
Yeah, they go back to where they know. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, real quick, though, I want to back up to what I think is one of the most effective and disturbing parts of the movie, which is in between the parts we're talking about, where there's that sequence where they have the soldiers going into the apartment building.
Yes.
At the beginning. And that is something that feels very relevant to me because, it's this thing of like all these people jammed together in a tight space spreading a virus.
Yeah, I mean,
and
there's
it's a very
lot of
bleak part of the movie, too.
It really is. It's really maybe the darkest portion of the film.
Yeah, it's so bleak.
And yeah, I mean, some of the police officers are basically indiscriminately shooting people in the building. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think Romero is saying something in that moment about how our authority figures will respond in times of crisis. Who is going to be vulnerable, truly vulnerable during these times? I think it is the most nightmarish sequence in the movie. But they end up at a shopping mall, and they end up sort of fortifying the shopping mall, and it becomes this sort of consumer, I want to say paradise, but it's kind of a combination paradise and prison for them.
Sort of. They're alone in this space that's normally full of people, and like technically it is the dream, right, to have everything in the mall you want for free. Right,
but they're not necessarily happy. There's a long kind of melancholy stretch in the middle of the movie where it's them kind of living some semblance of, one could say, a normal life, but it's obviously it's a completely manufactured one, which makes a lot of it kind of sad. They're sort of stuck in this space together. But I was struck the last time I watched it by how much this thing really works as an action movie.
Yeah, because, initially the mall is full of zombies and they have to kind of clear it out space by space before they can even get into this sort of like empty facsimile of a consumer middle American existence, right?
Yeah, totally. And so you have long scenes of them running around the mall. There's one sequence where they're in a department store and they have to lead the zombies basically to one level outside of the store, to one level, in order to get by through the lower level. And it's just such accomplished action filmmaking during those portions. And it's so fluid, and he's cross-cutting between characters. It really is like, and I, people tend to think of this movie as a horror classic, but I watch it and I really think that it's a fabulous horror or action movie as well.
Yeah, it blends genres really well because he puts a lot of humor into these scenes too, just of the zombies wandering the mall and the different ways they get, picked off. A lot of it's really funny.
And some of them look there's like a Hare Krishna there as well.
Yeah.
He plays he's walking a really fine tonal tightrope there between seeing the zombies as figures of real menace, and I mean they're a terrifying force of danger, but they are comic figures. They're sort of slapstick. Yeah. They're these kind of slapstick creations as well, and it's kind of remarkable that he's able to toe that line.
Well, like one zombie isn't that big of a deal. You can just, pop it in the head, no big deal. But when there's thousands of them, then that's a force thing. You can't fight that many of them.
Yep. As in the original, as in Night of the Living Dead, the movie is about characters confined in a single place. But the environment is so different, and I don't mean just aesthetically. I mean that Night of the Living Dead is all about confinement and is all about, there's a claustrophobic energy to it. These characters trapped in these very small spaces together with the threat around them. This is definitely a movie where there's a lot more wide open space, and I would even go as far to say that the characters at times put themselves in danger that isn't there. One of the more interesting things about the film is that they could actually live in this place pretty comfortably for a long period of time if they were more careful in some ways.
Yeah, as long as the food lasts, then they can just stay there, once they've done the initial sweep and, cleaned it up. Then they could just stay there as long as the food lasts.
Yeah. One of the things that I always, as a kid, that really appealed to me about this film, obviously, was that there is some gnarly Tom Savini gore in it. He obviously would kind of perfect that in the next film in the series, which is Day of the Dead, which has, I think to this day, some of the most revolting, elaborate gore that I've ever seen in a movie.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to, impugn the good name of Tom Savini because I think he's excellent, but he's definitely still developing the effect style here. And there are some of the zombies are just basically, gray face paint and liquid latex.
Right, of course. Yeah, I mean, some of the effects have not aged terribly well, some of the effects in this film. I think that you kind of accept the reality of the film, but I do think that the gore is still pretty good.
Yes, I agree that the filmmaking makes it so, like, if you're watching a goofy, dumb, poorly made Italian horror movie with those kind of effects, you would make fun of the effects all day. But nobody makes fun of the effects in Dawn of the Dead because the filmmaking is so good.
Right, and because we've built such a relationship with these characters, there's a lot of interesting tensions in the relationships. The two police officer characters are they're these kind of no-nonsense, get-the-job-done guys, you know?
Particularly Ken Foray.
That's right. Yeah,
as
who
Peter.
is fantastic in this movie, by the way.
He's so good in this movie. Yeah,
he's really, really good. But so they become this kind of surrogate family, and it's a big source of why the film is pretty melancholy on top of everything else it is. And we come to care for all of them. Even, I mean, the Flyboy character you were talking about kind of regularly screws up. He's not built for this kind of life the way that the other two are necessarily.
He's not trained.
There's a lot of inherent drama in their interactions and the role that he plays in the group. He's also romantically involved with our main character, Francine, I believe is her name.
Francine.
Played by Galen Ross, and that becomes this element that becomes pretty important to the film as well. I won't say too much more about it for those who haven't seen it. By the way, if you haven't seen this movie, please watch it.
It's it's an entertaining film to watch, but its worldview is definitely nihilistic. Yeah. You know, like the question of like having a child in this world is a very like bleak thing to think about. And again, I'm not going to spoil it. But the end also, the very end and what happens does show a worldview where people are animals and we're all fucked because of it.
I don't know. I don't entirely agree with you.
You don't think that's a bleak ending?
I think that the ending is about grappling with that knowledge and that reality and saying, do we go forward? Do we stop? Or do we try to move forward?
Do you give into it or do you fight it?
Give in? Yes. Do you give into it or do you keep fighting it? And I actually find the end kind of profound in that respect, in asking that question. I mean, again, I don't want to say too much about the ending of this film, but I do think that it ends on something of an ellipses. And
it does.
Regardless of where the series goes from there, I think that there's something self-contained about that ellipses. I know that sounds a little oxymoronic, but I think that you can look at the end of this movie and decide to see this as a kind of final statement, at least on these characters. And I don't have any particular desire to see their story continue because I think it ends on it concludes on a perfectly inconclusive note, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I can see what you mean about the choice and everything in the fact that it does end in the ellipses is what gives it some ambiguity to possibly not be totally dark.
Yeah. I mean, make no mistake, his worldview is very dark, and I think as the series has progressed, it's gotten in a lot of ways darker. I mean, Day of the Dead is, I think, the bleakest of the series. I would prefer to not have to acknowledge any of the films after Land of the Dead, the fourth one.
Oh, there were films after Land of the Dead?
Oh yes, Survival of the Dead.
I know.
You're kidding.
I'm joking. Like, those don't exist in our world. Because I agree.
Exactly.
Let's not talk about it. Especially not the found footage one. Oh my God.
Agreed. I obviously greatly prefer the original to Zack Snyder's remake from 2004.
Yeah, I mean, it's the best Zack Snyder movie, but that's like saying the best Michael Bay movie a little bit.
Yeah, I'm not a big Snyder fan. I will say that he does a couple things in that film that I like. I believe James Gunn worked on the screenplay, and there is a certain nastiness to it that I can appreciate. There's a pregnancy in that film. The way that is resolved is quite nasty, in a way that I kind of admire as a horror fan anyway. And I will say that the opening 15-20 minutes of the remake are quite superb. That opening sequence plus the Johnny Cash credit sequence. I'll say this, Snyder is very good at credit sequences. Yeah.
Yeah, like that movie has style, and it does go there, but I just feel like the original really has Romero's like point of view baked into it in a way that the remake doesn't.
For sure. Well, so you cannot stream that film from many of the major providers. I will say that there is a 4K rip of it on YouTube. It's what I was watching last night, and it's very good. I don't know how long. Normally, we're a little reluctant about recommending alternative means of watching things, but I think this is at least one case where I don't think anybody would hold it against you if you watched this, in my opinion, this masterpiece any way that you can, and it is so it is on YouTube. There's a 4K version. If you haven't seen it, please watch it. I think you'll like it a lot.
And if you have a roommate or a significant other who's a horror fan, maybe go to him and be like, hey, do you have Dawn of the Dead? And they'll be like, absolutely, I've been waiting for you to say that to me.
Well, I think that's probably all the time we have today, although all of us have a lot of time now on our hands in some respects. But
yeah, you gonna watch anything tonight, Alex?
You know, I might. I am thinking about watching a couple films that were released a few years ago. One of them is called Olympus Has Fallen. The other one is called White House Down.
Yeah.
Something we've been talking for a long time about here at the AV Club is it's called the Premise Dome. It is a feature that's sort of been in the works for a very long time that we've never launched. And the idea is that we pit two films with very similar premises, often films that came out very close to each other. They're called twin films, I believe is the term they use to describe this phenomenon.
It happens enough there's a term for it.
Exactly. These two particular films are both about the president under siege at the White House and being sort of protected by a single dogged Secret Service agent. Again, both these movies came out a few years ago.
Because Olympus Has Fallen is such a stupid movie.
Well, so what I want to say is that I think next week what we're going to do is we're going to talk about these two films, and each of us is going to take a position on them. I will not tell you who is for which one, but I will say that we both prefer one to the other. And next week we're going to talk about that. And hopefully, I'm hoping that we can get something together where we can allow all of you listening to vote on which is your favorite. Because I would love to be able to talk about that on the show, too, and just to acknowledge that people agree with me because I'm right.
Well, I mean...
Or maybe not.
We shall see. We shall see. Because, it's funny, a little bit behind the curtain, we talked about a few different ideas for Premise Dome, and we were both just like, oh, I prefer this one. No, I prefer that one too. And so we had to try out a couple to come up with one where we disagreed.
It's true. It's true. So please check back next week. That's what we're going to be talking about. Again, we're going to keep the show going. We'll just be recording remotely, and we'll be trying different things here and there, and also occasionally talking about the movies that actually are going to be hitting streaming platforms and available on VOD, because like you, we'll be at home and we can watch them.
All right, thank you so much for joining us today. Please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We especially appreciate it in these times. Everything's crazy, so please listen to our podcast, I guess.
Stay healthy, folks.
Bye.